Incident in Utah, the Skinwalker's Shadow. A group of friends decided to camp in Utah near the Uintah Basin, infamous for its ties to Skinwalker lore. As they sat around the campfire, the air grew unnaturally still. It was like even the crickets stopped chirping, one of them, Marcus, reported. Around 1 a.m., they heard someone calling out in a strained voice from the woods. It sounded like one of their friends, Amber, who had gone to the car to grab more marshmallows. "Help! Something's wrong," the voice cried. When Amber returned to the camp a few minutes later, carrying marshmallows, the group froze. "Who was calling us?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. Amber hadn't screamed at all, she explained. From the edge of the woods, something stepped closer to the firelight. It looked human but unnaturally elongated, its joints bending in the wrong directions. Its face was eerily similar to Amber's but distorted as if seen through warped glass. The group fled, leaving their belongings behind. They swore they heard it laughing, an unearthly, guttural sound. Minnesota's Wendigo Warning. Nathan and his cousin Ellie were hiking near the boundary waters of Minnesota. They were miles from civilization, enveloped by the dense forest, when they came upon a deer carcass. It wasn't unusual to find remains in the wild, but this deer looked like it had been drained of blood, its rib cage cracked open as if something had ripped it apart with immense force. As they inspected the carcass, Nathan noticed something chilling, massive footprints in the snow, each larger than his boot. "At first, we thought it might be a bear," Ellie recounted, "but the stride was too long, and the footprints had claw marks." As dusk fell, they began hearing heavy breathing, though there was no wind. Then came a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from every direction. They turned to see a towering figure, gaunt and skeletal, with hollow, glowing eyes. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and animal, with sharp teeth glinting in its gaping mouth. Ellie screamed, and the figure bolted toward them with inhuman speed. The pair ran back to their car, abandoning their campsite. Nathan later said, "When I looked back, it wasn't chasing us. It just stood there, watching, like it wanted us to know it could catch us if it wanted to." Skinwalker Ranch drone footage. A more recent report comes from a drone enthusiast who explored areas around the infamous Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. While flying his drone, he captured footage of what appeared to be a humanoid figure sprinting across the desert on all fours. "When I slowed the footage down, I could see it turn its head," he explained. "Its face wasn't human, it looked like a coyote, but with pale, sunken skin." The man claims that after returning home, strange things started happening. Scratches appeared on his walls, electronics malfunctioned, and he heard whispering at night. He refuses to return to the area. Northern Alberta, the Wendigos whisper. A trapper in Alberta, Canada, shared his harrowing encounter on a survivalist forum. While checking his traps, he noticed signs of an animal tearing through the snow in a frenzy. Following the trail, he discovered a horrifying scene. One of his traps had snared a creature he couldn't identify. "It was thin, almost skeletal, but freakishly strong," he wrote. "Its eyes glowed in the dark, like embers, and it gnawed on the steel trap as if trying to break free." The trapper backed away, terrified, but not before the creature locked eyes with him. "It smiled, or at least I think it did. Its lips pulled back, and I swear I heard it say, 'Run.'" He fired a warning shot and ran for his cabin. That night, the creature circled his cabin, its voice imitating his own cries for help. When morning came, the tracks outside were gone, but claw marks remained etched deep into the wood. Arizona desert, the Skinwalker stalker. Tyler and Jenna were driving through the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona late at night. The road was desolate, illuminated only by their headlights. Suddenly, they saw a figure dart across the road on all fours. Tyler slammed on the brakes, swerving to avoid it. "It was too fast to be human, but it wasn't an animal," Jenna explained. "It moved like something between a wolf and a person." They pulled over to catch their breath, but their car wouldn't start again. Then came the sound, a tapping on the back window. When Tyler turned to look, he saw a face, half human, half coyote, grinning at him with jagged teeth. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving behind claw marks on the trunk of their car. Local Navajo elders later told them they were lucky to have survived, as skinwalkers are said to curse or kill those who encounter them. Colorado Wilderness, Wendigo in the Wind. An experienced hiker named Samantha shared her story from the dense forests of Colorado's Rocky Mountains. She was several days into a solo hiking trip when the weather turned unusually cold and still, despite it being midsummer. She began to feel as though she was being followed. I kept hearing something behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing there, she wrote in her journal. On the third night, Samantha woke to the sound of her name being called from the darkness. It wasn't the friendly tone of a fellow hiker, it was hollow and sinister. Shaking, she shone her flashlight into the trees, only to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. The creature stepped into the beam of light, a grotesquely thin, emaciated figure with sharp, claw-like hands and antlers sprouting from its head. Its voice was guttural as it said, "Hungry." Samantha grabbed her pack and fled, running until dawn. When she returned with authorities later to retrieve her belongings, her campsite was destroyed. Her tent was shredded, and deep claw marks scored the trees around the area. Virginia Farmhouse, the Skinwalker's Laughter. A family in rural Virginia reported a series of unsettling events after purchasing a farm near the Appalachian foothills. It began with their livestock acting strangely. Sheep refused to enter the barn at dusk, and their dog howled incessantly at night. One evening, the father, Ben, heard laughter coming from the woods. Thinking it might be trespassers, he grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. He stopped dead when he saw his wife standing at the edge of the tree line, smiling at him. Except his wife was inside the house, yelling for him to come back. The figure at the tree line mimicked her voice, saying, "Ben, come here," but its tone was eerily off, as if the words were being forced through unfamiliar vocal cords. Ben ran back inside, and the family locked all the doors. The next morning, they found strange tracks circling the house, barefoot human prints that turned into hooves halfway through. Ontario's northern lakes, the Wendigo's reflection. A group of ice fishermen had a terrifying experience on a frozen lake in northern Ontario. They had been fishing all day when one of them, Dave, ventured farther out to drill a hole away from the group. After some time, the others noticed he hadn't returned. They found him standing perfectly still, staring down into the hole he had drilled. When they called to him, he didn't respond. As they approached, they saw his face, pale, his eyes wide with terror. He whispered, "It's under the ice." Suddenly, the ice beneath Dave cracked, and a skeletal hand with impossibly long fingers shot up, clawing at his leg. The others pulled him away just in time, but not before seeing the creature's face under the ice, a sunken, ghastly visage with sharp teeth and empty eye sockets. The men fled the lake and never returned. Dave, traumatized, later claimed the creature spoke to him in his mind, begging him to join the hunger. Wyoming truck stop, Skinwalker hitchhiker. A long-haul trucker named Mike shared his eerie experience while driving through Wyoming late one night. Stopping at a nearly abandoned truck stop, he noticed a figure standing by the road, thumbing for a ride. "I don't pick up hitchhikers," he said, "but something about this guy made me shiver." He described the man as wearing old, tattered clothes and having a face that didn't look quite right, too smooth, with a vacant expression. Mike drove off, but minutes later, the same figure was suddenly walking by the road again, miles ahead of where he'd seen him. Panicking, Mike sped up, but the figure turned to face him, its mouth stretching impossibly wide into a predatory grin. As he passed, the figure whispered his name, despite Mike having never said it aloud. When he reached his destination, he found deep scratches down the side of his truck, as if something with claws had been running alongside him the entire way. Oklahoma Prairie, the Skinwalker's Song. In the remote prairies of Oklahoma, a rancher named Clint reported a series of strange incidents on his property. It began with his cattle acting skittish, refusing to graze in the farthest pasture. Then, one night, Clint heard a soft humming outside his bedroom window, a haunting tune that seemed to change in pitch and rhythm, like a child's lullaby gone wrong. When he stepped outside with his rifle, he saw a figure crouched near the barn. It looked like a man, but its movements were jerky and unnatural, as if it were a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Clint shouted at the figure, but instead of running, it began to stand. Its face was eerily smooth, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. It opened its mouth to hum again, but this time the sound came from all around him, as if the wind itself carried the tune. Clint fired a warning shot, and the creature bolted into the darkness. The next morning, he found a necklace made of bones hanging from the barn door, along with claw-like scratches etched into the wood. Montana Wilderness, the Wendigos Feast. A group of friends on a snowmobiling trip in Montana found themselves stranded when one of their vehicles broke down deep in the forest. As night fell, they built a fire to keep warm, but their unease grew when they noticed the woods had gone completely silent. Then, they smelled it, a foul, metallic odor, like rotting meat mixed with rust. One of the friends, Jake, swore he saw something moving in the trees, but the others laughed it off as paranoia. When they woke the next morning, Jake was gone. His snowmobile and belongings were untouched, but large, skeletal footprints surrounded the campsite. The group searched for him, following a trail of blood that led to a nearby clearing. There, they found Jake, or what was left of him. His body was torn apart, his ribcage gnawed clean. Above them, perched in the branches of a tree, was a creature with glowing eyes and a skeletal frame. It hissed at them, then vanished into the trees. Terrified, the friends abandoned their gear and hiked miles back to safety. Search parties later found no trace of Jake or the creature, only the remains of the clearing stained red. Nevada Desert, Skinwalker Surveillance. A paranormal investigator named Aaron set up cameras near an abandoned stretch of desert road in Nevada after hearing reports of strange activity. Locals spoke of a shapeshifter that had been mimicking voices and causing car accidents. On her second night of filming, Aaron reviewed the footage and saw something impossible. A lone coyote wandered into view, limping as if injured. But as it approached the camera, it stopped, stood on its hind legs, and began to change. The creature's limbs elongated, its fur receded, and its face twisted into a grotesque, half-human shape. It stared directly into the lens and grinned. Then it spoke in a raspy, mocking tone, "Watching won't save you." When Erin returned to retrieve her cameras, she found them smashed to pieces. The ground around the area was littered with claw marks, and her car tires had been slashed. Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Wendigo Howl. A couple, Greg and Sarah, were camping in Michigan's Upper Peninsula when they were awoken by a distant howl. It wasn't a wolf, Greg insisted. It sounded deeper, almost human but filled with rage. The howls grew closer as the night went on, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps circling their tent. Greg grabbed a flashlight and peeked outside, only to see a gaunt figure with glowing red eyes standing just beyond the firelight. Its breath was visible in the cold air, despite the mild summer evening. It looked like it hadn't eaten in years, Sarah said later. But the way it stared at us, you could tell it was starving. When Greg yelled to scare it off, the creature let out a deafening scream that made their ears ring. It lunged at the tent, clawing through the fabric, but stopped just short of entering. Instead, it whispered, "Leave now, or feed me." The couple abandoned their gear and ran for their lives. When they returned with rangers the next day, their campsite was destroyed, with claw marks and scorch marks on the ground. New Mexico's highways, Skinwalker pursuit. In New Mexico, a truck driver named Luis shared his harrowing experience while hauling freight late one night. He noticed a pair of glowing eyes in his rearview mirror, something running behind his truck at an impossible speed. "I thought it was an animal at first, but then it stood up on two legs," Luis said. The creature began pounding on the back of the trailer, causing the whole rig to shake. When he looked in the mirror again, the creature was grinning at him, its face eerily human but wrong, its mouth too wide, its teeth too sharp. Luis floored the gas pedal, but the creature kept pace, slamming its fists into the trailer. Finally, he swerved onto a busier road, and the creature veered off into the desert. The next morning, Luis inspected his trailer and found deep dents and scratches. His dashcam, however, had mysteriously stopped recording during the incident. Alaska's frozen tundra, the Wendigos' territory. A hunter in remote Alaska, known only as Eli, reported seeing something he couldn't explain while tracking caribou. As he skied across the frozen tundra, he noticed strange markings in the snow, huge, clawed footprints that seemed to appear and disappear without a pattern. That night, Eli camped in a small snow shelter he had built. As the wind howled outside, he heard something digging. He crawled out to investigate and saw a gaunt, skeletal figure dragging a caribou carcass through the snow. The creature stopped and turned toward him, its hollow eyes locking onto his. It grinned like it knew I was next, Eli later recounted. Terrified, he grabbed his rifle and fired, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a guttural growl and disappeared into the storm. When Eli returned to civilization, he noticed frostbite scars on his hands, despite wearing gloves the entire time. Locals whispered that the Wendigo had marked him, ensuring it would find him again someday. Utah Caves, the Skinwalker's Trap. Two spelunkers, Max and Danny, decided to explore a system of caves near Skinwalker Ranch, drawn by the legends and mystery of the area. As they ventured deeper, they noticed something peculiar, scratches on the walls, far too deliberate to be caused by erosion or tools. Then, they heard it, a faint voice echoing through the tunnels, calling Max's name. Danny insisted it was just their voices bouncing back, but the tone of the echo changed. The voice wasn't theirs, it was something else mimicking them, but its cadence was unnatural, almost taunting. As panic set in, Max shone his flashlight into the darkness and saw movement. A humanoid figure crawled along the cave wall, impossibly fast, its joints bending backward like an insect's. They bolted for the surface, but the figure followed, staying just out of sight. When they finally escaped the cave, the entrance collapsed behind them, as if something didn't want them to return. The locals later warned them they were lucky to leave with their lives. Skinwalkers are said to trap their prey in dark places and feast slowly on their fear. Ontario Cabin, Wendigo at the Window. In a remote hunting cabin deep in Ontario's wilderness, a man named Henry spent the winter alone, preparing for his yearly trapping season. One night, as a blizzard howled outside, he heard a faint tapping at the window. He ignored it at first, assuming it was just tree branches swaying in the wind. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Finally, Henry grabbed his lantern and peered outside. What he saw froze him in place. A gaunt, skeletal face with hollow eyes stared back at him, its breath visible on the frost-covered glass. The creature smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and whispered in a voice barely audible over the storm, "Let me in, I'm so cold." Henry bolted the door and stayed awake all night, clutching his rifle. By morning, the storm had passed, but claw marks covered the windows and door. The snow outside was undisturbed, as if the creature had never been there, or had left no footprints. Texas Plains, the Skinwalker's Decoy. Near the Texas-New Mexico border, a farmer named Rosa reported seeing strange lights in the sky over her fields. Curious, she went out to investigate one night, only to find her neighbor's dog standing motionless in her driveway. The dog looked odd, its fur seemed patchy, and its body was unnaturally still. When Rosa called to it, the dog turned to face her, but its eyes were not a dog's. They were human. Terrified, Rosa backed away, but the dog's body began to shift, its limbs elongating and its face stretching grotesquely. In a deep, rasping voice, it said, "You shouldn't have come outside." Rosa ran back into her house, locking every door and window. All night, she heard scratching at the walls and the sound of her own voice calling her name from the fields. Alaskan Fishing Village, the Wendigo's Feast. In a remote Alaskan fishing village, a group of locals began disappearing during the long winter nights. When search parties went out, They found strange tracks leading away from the village, footprints that started human but morphed into massive, clawed impressions. One hunter, Peter, claimed to have seen the creature responsible. While following the tracks, he stumbled upon a clearing where an elk carcass had been torn apart. Standing over the remains was a towering, skeletal figure with glowing eyes and antlers sprouting from its head. The creature turned to Peter, its hollow voice booming through the icy air, "Hunger never ends." Peter barely escaped, but the attacks stopped after a local shaman performed a cleansing ritual. Even so, the villagers say the Wendigo only slumbers, it will awake when hunger strikes again. Arizona Reservation, Skinwalker Circle. A group of Navajo teens were driving home from a late-night basketball game when they noticed something running alongside their truck. At first, they thought it was a coyote, but it was moving too fast, easily keeping pace at 60 miles per hour. When the creature veered closer, they saw it was no animal. It had the body of a man, but its face was twisted, a hybrid of human and wolf. One of the teens screamed as it banged on the truck's door with clawed hands. Panicked, the driver swerved off the road, and the creature stopped abruptly, standing in the middle of the road watching them. It raised one hand and pointed toward them, its mouth opening wide in a soundless scream. When they told their families, the elders performed a ceremony to protect them, warning that skinwalkers don't just attack randomly, they mark their prey. Vermont Forest, the Wendigo's Trail. A family hiking in Vermont's Green Mountains discovered a strange, overgrown path that wasn't marked on their map. Curious, they decided to follow it, despite the growing sense of unease. The deeper they went, the colder it became, even though it was mid-July. Then they noticed the smell, a rancid, metallic odor that made their stomachs churn. When they reached the end of the trail, they found a clearing filled with bones, animal and human. Before they could react, a figure emerged from the trees, towering and skeletal, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The creature didn't move toward them but instead whispered in a voice that echoed unnaturally, "Stay. I need more." The family fled, stumbling back to the main trail. When they reported the incident to authorities, no clearing or path was ever found, but the forest ranger who investigated resigned shortly after, refusing to speak of what he saw. Arizona Desert, the Skinwalker Stalker. Tyler and Jenna were driving through the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona late at night. The road was desolate, illuminated only by their headlights. Suddenly, they saw a figure dart across the road on all fours. Tyler slammed on the brakes, swerving to avoid it. It was too fast to be human, but it wasn't an animal, Jenna explained. It moved like something between a wolf and a person. They pulled over to catch their breath, but their car wouldn't start again. Then came the sound, a tapping on the back window. When Tyler turned to look, he saw a face, half human, half coyote, grinning at him with jagged teeth. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving behind claw marks on the trunk of their car. Local Navajo elders later told them they were lucky to have survived, as skinwalkers are said to curse or kill those who encounter them. Colorado Wilderness, Wendigo in the Wind. An experienced hiker named Samantha shared her story from the dense forests of Colorado's Rocky Mountains. She was several days into a solo hiking trip when the weather turned unusually cold and still, despite it being midsummer. She began to feel as though she was being followed. "I kept hearing something behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing there," she wrote in her journal. On the third night, Samantha woke to the sound of her name being called from the darkness. It wasn't the friendly tone of a fellow hiker, it was hollow and sinister. Shaking, she shone her flashlight into the trees, only to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. The creature stepped into the beam of light, a grotesquely thin, emaciated figure with sharp, claw-like hands and antlers sprouting from its head. Its voice was guttural as it said, "Hungry." Samantha grabbed her pack and fled, running until dawn. When she returned with authorities later to retrieve her belongings, her campsite was destroyed. Her tent was shredded, and deep claw marks scored the trees around the area.